The reason is as follows. Last December, I wrote a piece on the economic policies of Trump. I said some of them, like deregulation, low taxes, pro-private sector, will increase growth and reduce inflation, while others are dangerous, like having tariff, protectionist, trade wars, restriction to migration, excessive deficit could increase inflation, reduce growth. So there were positive and there were negative. And then the question was what the balance of the two. And I pointed out that there are 4 major guardrails would constrain the bad policy and preventing those bad policies from becoming severe. And that's exactly what happened in the last week. The first constraining guardrail was market discipline. The stock market fell sharply, almost reached the bear market, but more importantly, in the last few days, the bond yields went higher, credit spreads were higher, and there was a risk of disorderly collapse of the dollar. And Trump can control his party, can control Congress, can control the Supreme Court, can control even social media, because his buddy Elon Musk owns X, but he cannot control the bond vigilantes, the stock market and the credit market vigilantes. The former advisor of Bill Clinton, Jim Carville, said 2 things that are memorable. One, it's the economy is stupid. If the economy goes into recession, you're in trouble. But 2, more importantly, said, in my next life, I don't want to be born as the Pope or even the President of the United States. I want to be born as the bond vigilantes, because I can go around and beat up all those people who have bad policies or are against me. So the most powerful people in the world are investors. Investors in the stock market, in the bond market, in the credit market, the FX market said to Trump, if you do this, it's going to be a financial and economic disaster. That was first guardrail. And I said, market discipline is going to work. Second, Fed discipline. There was a game of chicken between Donald Trump and Powell, head of the Fed. Who's going to blink first? Trump thought he could push the Fed to blink and cut rates following the market meltdown. But Powell is worried about inflation coming from tariffs. He's not going to blink. The Fed is independent. It will be a mistake for the Fed to cut rates. So Powell held up, says, I'm not going to cut rates. And therefore, the Fed independence was another source of discipline that forced instead Trump to then delay by 90 days the tariffs on most trading partners, with the exception of China. China is a different story. 3, economic advisors. Some of the economic advisors of Trump were really reckless. Peter Navarro, Howard Lutnick, Stephen Miller. Those were really huge trade hawks. They wanted what Trump did on April 2nd. But there are other ones who understand economies and understanding markets. One is Scott Bessent, Secretary of the Treasury. Second one is head of the Council of Economic Advisors, Steve Miran. The third one is Kevin Hassett, head of the National Economic Council. Those ones told him, escalate gradually to de-escalate. Initially, they did not have the upper hand. Trump, following his own worst instincts, followed what Navarro was telling him. But eventually, when the markets collapsed, stock market in bear market, the bond yields went through the roof, credit spreads, high yield and high grade were exploding, and the dollar was starting to sink, then they told him, do you want to double down or you want to blink? And they convinced him to blink. And I've said all along for months that the advisor are going to tell him when he does stupid things, Mr. President, do you want to double down on the bad policies and the market, the economy crashes, or you want to relent and negotiate and blink and start the dialogue with most trading partners? So the economic advisors were also part of the story. So market discipline, Fed discipline, good economic advisors. And 4, I argued that he has a thin majority in Congress, and some congressmen are going to be destroyed by tariffs, their own constituency, are not going to vote for that stuff. And there was a push now in Congress, in the Senate and the House, to pass legislation to constrain the trade negotiation power of the president, saying you cannot do these things by executive order. So I said in December, market discipline, Fed discipline, good advisors, and thin majority in Congress. Those are guardrails that prevent the policy from becoming destructive. Guess what? He blinked on providing a 90-day pause for the country who do not retaliate. They're most of the world. The only exception, as I said for the last few days, is China. Yeah. China, in this game of chicken, Xi Jinping is not going to blink. And now there is a tit for tat trade escalation.
So yesterday he backed down on reciprocal tariffs, but he also said that he intended to introduce new tariffs, for example, on pharmaceutical drugs. What do you think that ultimately is President Trump's game plan, if there is one? Is it disruption for disruption's sake?
No, in his view of the world that I disagree with, he believes that a strong dollar, given the global reserve currency role of the dollar, and trade policies and currency policies of both friends and allies and enemies like China have led to strong dollar and deindustrialization of America, and he wants to reshore manufacturing in autos, in pharma, in semiconductor, in steel, aluminum, and so on and so on. I don't think it's a strategy that's going to work, but some of the logic of the tariff is reshoring manufacturing. Some logic of the tariff is to raise tariff revenue that it needs to finance its tax cuts. Some of it is to, with a risk of tariff, having tariff jumping FDI, forcing like in the 80s. In the 80s, Japan was threatened with tariffs on autos. What did they do? They started producing cars in the US. So some of it is to say Europeans and others, we have cheap energy, we have good financial markets, come and invest in the United States. That's part of the reshoring. So there is a warped logic. It's not totally irrational. There is some logic, even if having very high tariff and destructive trade war is not the way to do it. But I knew that it would essentially blink, that it would start negotiation. And by the way, right now the tariff announced on Europe is 20%.
Yeah.
Suspended for 90 days at 10. In a matter of weeks, it doesn't take months, Europeans can go and negotiate a deal with Trump. What does Trump want the Europeans? He wants them to spend more on defense. 2% is not anymore a ceiling. 2% of GDP is a floor. The Europeans will have to go to 3%. And by the way, they need it for their own sake, rather than what Trump is telling them. Second, Europeans, as they spend more on defense, cannot rely only on European procurement. There is not the supply chains of weapons. So for a while, many years, they'll have to buy more US weapons. As you buy more US weapons, your trade surplus with US shrinks. You import more of US weapons. 3, Europeans cannot rely anymore on natural gas from Russia. Guess what? US tons of natural gas. They're building the pipelines, they're building the LNG terminals. You'll have tons of cheap LNG. European natural gas costs 4 times as much as the US. That's going to help. 4, you'll have to buy more agricultural goods from Europe because you're very strict at that trade. Of course, your farmers in Greece or over Europe are going to get upset, but guess what? You're going to subsidize them. US is subsidizing its own farmers. The European will have to subsidize their own farmers, but you'll have to open up trade in that. 5, you have to de-risk your relationship with China. China is destroying the US automotive sector with their cheap EVs that have been subsidized by China. So it's not just the US that has to de-risk the relation with China. It's also the European and the US together have to say in critical stuff, high-tech, AI, machine learning, robotic, automation, semiconductors, green tech, and electric vehicles, and so on, we cannot have China take over the world. So you de-risk the relation of China on the technology.
But what does Europe bring to
and
the
then you
table?
do other things. And if you do these things, you can do a deal in a month. Trump is going to declare victory, and instead of 20% tariff, you'll end up with 10. Now, is 10 a good idea? No. Is 10 is going to destroy Europe? Of course not. I mean, the euro can go up and down 10% in a month. So 10% plus or minus on the currency, it's like a 10% tariff. So if the end game is a 10% tariff on European goods, big deal. There are more tariffs within Europe than whatever Trump is going to impose. Draghi wrote rightly a piece on FT saying the internal tariffs within Europe are much more than any tariff that Trump is going to impose on us. So Europe has to reform and has to open up and has to integrate and has to follow the advice of Letta, of Draghi on reforming, opening up, becoming more competitive, innovate and so on. Otherwise, it's going to self-destruct. Europe needs the Trump shock because Europe has been living as if the world has not changed. And this, as Christine Lagarde said, this is an existential threat to Europe. So either Europe reforms, integrates, does more innovation, more competitiveness, makes the single market full, or otherwise, it doesn't matter what Trump does. Europe is going to self-destruct. So Europe needed a shock, and the shock, like the global financial crisis, led to more integration. COVID crisis led to more integration. The gig crisis led to more integration. This crisis is going to lead either to more integration, more reform, more opening up, more risk-taking, more innovation, more growth, or otherwise Europe is dead, regardless of Trump.
But in the negotiations table, what can Europe bring?
As I told you, they can spend more on defense, they can buy more US weapons, they can buy more US LNG, they can buy more ag products, they can de-risk with China, they can let the euro appreciate, they can do some more investment in energy intensive sectors in the US. They can do all these things. You do these things, Trump is going to say, greatest deal in history of humanity. Thank you. We're going to be friends like before.
But it seems highly unlikely that all of the European countries will agree, all of the European countries that are NATO members as well will agree to pay 3% on defense.
You have no choice. You have no choice. Either you spend, not tomorrow, but either you get the goal. As I said, 2% is not anymore. It used to be the ceiling, now is the floor. Almost all NATO members, with the exception of 2, are already almost at 2%. So the new normal, the new size 0, is not 2, it's 3.
Yeah.
So get used to it. Either you do 3 for your own sake, because US may not be there to help you, so you have to defend yourself. So 3 is the minimum. You have to get to 3 on your own. If you get to 3, it's not going to destroy NATO. It's going to say there is burden sharing, you're doing your own share. Okay, we have NATO. You spend more, you do more of your procurement, and you keep on buying our own defense tech. When the German announced that they're going to spend more on defense, there was a line in the announcement, it was critical. It said, we cannot spend anymore $25 million on a stupid tank that can be destroyed by $10,000 drone. That doesn't work anymore in modern warfare, as the Russia-Ukraine war showed. You cannot do it. You have to have defense tech. Who's doing defense tech in Europe? Nobody. There is defense tech in Ukraine, where now they're producing millions of drones literally a year, and there's defense tech in the United States. So you want to spend more on defense, well, you're going to spend it on tanks that can be destroyed, you want to spend it on your crappy, with due respect, European jet fighters. No, you'll have to buy more defense tech from the US, you'll have to buy F-35s, because the Swedish and the French fighter jets are a joke. So you have no choice for the next 10 years but having more spending on defense with US technology, with US intelligence, with US procurement. That's what you need to do. You have no choice. You have to do it, because if you don't do it, NATO is dead.
Why is Trump not imposing tariffs on Russia?
You know, he's imposing 10% on Ukraine like everybody else, minimum universal, but not on Russia, because Russia is already subject to, 1,000 different sanctions. So there's no trade. You might say you want to be nice to Putin, but it doesn't matter. For now, the massive amount of trade sanctions that US, Europe imposed, trade sanction, financial sanction, technological sanction, any sanction under the sun, imply that, that's like equivalent to 100% tariff. I mean, for all we know, Russia is having 100% tariff on its goods. Not just tariffs, we have export controls. We cannot sell to Russia, Europeans, American, almost nothing anymore. So it doesn't matter. Symbolically it says that did not sanction Russia, but we already sanctioned Russia more than any country in the world. The issue is going to be, if the Russian and the Ukrainians reach a deal, then whether there is going to be some reduction over time of the sanction. To be seen, because so far Putin is still playing a stupid game of trying to wait out Trump. But Trump made a mistake. The mistakes by beating up on the Ukrainians rather than beating up on Putin. And Putin can wait for now. But even Putin, if you put pressure on him, will have to blink. If Trump tells him, I really want a deal, he can force Putin to have a deal. But he has to change the balance and say, I'm nice to the Ukrainians and I'm tough on the Russians, as opposed to being tough on the Ukrainians and being soft on the Russians.
Do you see that happening?
I think yes, because he was mistaken. He thought, he could humor Putin by saying, I'm going to open up to you to accept the deal. Well, Putin, he was a master spy. He knows how to play poker and chess, three-dimensional poker and chess, while Trump doesn't even know how to play one-dimensional chess, let alone three-dimensional. So Putin is just having him, just fooling him around, outmaneuvering him. Because Trump, he thinks, that his art of the deal, stuff that can work in negotiating tactic, in real estate, carpetbagging, can work in geopolitics. In geopolitics, art of the deal, carpetbagging doesn't work. He just, both Xi Jinping and Putin are master chess players or master poker players. And Trump is not. You see what the mess he did with trade. He threatened everybody, and then he has to back down. He had to blink, completely blink, with everybody but China. But of course, China is a different story.
How do you see this playing out with China?
In the short run, in this game of chicken between Trump and Xi, Xi has the upper hand. He doesn't face election. Trump has election next year. If there is a recession, US, MAGA is dead. He can do massive monetary, fiscal, credit stimulus in China. He can weaken the currency. He can stimulate domestic consumption. He can manipulate the stock market. He's already doing it to push it higher. He has capital control. He can punish US not only with tariffs. Tariffs are not important because China exports more than US export to China. But he controls the production of rare earths. He controls the refining of all green metals, starting with copper. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of investments of US firms in China, from Apple to Tesla to everybody under the sun. He can punish US firms in China. He can do 10 different things. He can also become more aggressive on Taiwan. So in the short run, Xi has the upper hand, and you cannot just keep on counter-tariff him and he's going to blink. He's not going to blink. He has national pride. He feels that the US is trying to punish him not just on trade, but to contain him economically and contain him geopolitically and so on. And therefore, he's playing tough. And it's the second largest economy in the world, 1.4 billion people. Everybody else had to blink. It's not just Trump blinked. Europe blinked. It was clear they had to negotiate. Every friend and ally knows that if you don't start negotiation, then there's no NATO, there's no security, and you're dead. So everybody else had no leverage. So they blinked and Trump blinked. Instead, with China is a different story. Neither side blinks, and now it's a tit-for-tat escalation. Now, what happens next? Either you escalate and you have a destruction of trade, and it's not just trade. It means that growth collapses in China and inflation goes to the roof in the US, because every other product in Walmart, in a Target store, in Costco, in the dollar stores are cheap Chinese goods. That who's buying them? The poor working class and the blue collars that are left behind. So those people are going to be shafted if we maintain tariffs of 100%. There will be no imports of anything from China. And we depend on cheap Chinese goods for everything, these consumer products. So and in this game of chicken, Xi Jinping is not going to blink. Now, eventually, you can have a backdoor, dialogue among number twos or threes that leads to a call between Xi Jinping and Trump. Trump says Xi Jinping has to call me. Xi Jinping says, you started the war, you have to call him. The point is not who's going to call who. It's not as if somebody picks up the phone. You have to have a back channel that says, let's have a call to try to de-escalate. Now, even if you have that call and you de-escalate, Trump is not going to offer to China what he offered to everybody else. There's not going to be 90 days pause at 10%. There may be a 90-day pause at 50%, okay? 50, because with China, you have to play hardball to force them to change. So he's not going to offer to China, even if there is a negotiation, what he offered to Europe and everybody else.
Yeah.
And the question, do you even get to an agreement between US and China that they de-escalate to 50, both sides, and they start negotiation? Maybe yes, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe not this year. Maybe until things get worse. Okay, and now Trump feels, I did a deal with everybody else, starting negotiation. I'm going to reach negotiation, so I can corner China. Stock market went up 10% yesterday. So he says, hey, right now everybody else is on my side and China is not, so I can be tough with China and wait them out. So he's waiting them out, she's waiting him out. So the escalation is continuing. Over the medium term, however, China loses more. Because China has a huge trade surplus with US. Yeah. And if they cannot sell to the US, then you have a growth shock. And they have to diversify. And unless they create a social safety net, to increase consumption, they cannot dump their goods on the rest of the world. Because, you have excess capacity in China, you have demand shock in China, you have it in Europe, you have it everywhere else.
Mr. Wang disagreed with you yesterday. He said that they don't dump. It's the West that keeps asking for it.
That's a joke. That's a joke. As I said, the European is as worried as the US about Chinese taking over green tech, mobility, EVs. The auto sector in Europe is an existential threat. US has already imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. Europe has no choice as to do the same, and everything else. And as I said, it's not just US and Europe. The global South, Brazil, India, South Africa, all these countries do not want to be the dumping ground for the excess capacity of China. Even the eternal friends of China, the Russians, are explicitly saying right now, we're worried about the Chinese cars destroying our crappy Russian cars. And of course, Russian cars are crappy, but they have to worry about their own employment. You have an employment and growth problem everywhere around the world. China is 30% of global manufacturing and rising. Is that acceptable? No. China knows how to produce, how to do supply. They don't know how to do demand. So they do need, the only good news about the Trump shock on China, because really trade wars are terrible and it's done in the wrong way, but it forces China to decide to do a social safety net that reduces saving and increases consumption forever. If that's the result, that's a win. It's not on trade. The reform that China has to do are not restrictions to trade, are restrictions that imply that savings are too high, consumption is too low. It has nothing to do with trade. It has to do with having a social safety net. The Chinese have to save for old age, they have to save because they become unemployed and there is no unemployment insurance, they have to save because they get sick and there is not good health care, they have to save because the migrant workers don't have access to public services in the city where they live, they have to save because real wages are low, profits are high, and the share of labor income is low and the share of profit is high, and those profits don't go to the owners, they go and get reinvested into more overinvestment into capacity. So the entire model of China is one of squeezing consumption and doing lots of investment and lots of saving. That model is broken, is not acceptable to the world. It's not acceptable to the US, it's not acceptable to Europe, it's not acceptable to the global South, it's not even good for China. So China will be forced to change. That's going to be. It's not a trade change, it's a consumption change. It's a very different story.
What is the impact of this trade war on currencies? And what does a weaker dollar mean for crypto?
First of all, right now people thought that the dollar will strengthen because of a trade war, and instead has weakened. And it's weakened because people are worried about the credibility of the US, they're worried about erratic policies, and the losses on the stock market, the bond market, imply that if you're a foreign investor, you get the double whammy. You lose on the stock market and the bond market, and if the dollar weakens when you convert in euro or yen, or in whatever, you have a second loss, that is a capital loss on the currency. So it snowballs. When stock market fell, bond yield went higher, credit spread widened, you lost money on bonds, on credit, and on stocks. So money started to move, and instead of dollar going up, went down. And it started becoming actually dangerous. But over the medium term, this trade war doesn't matter, because US is the number one power in the technologies of the future. Officially, US growth today potential is 1.8. By the end of this decade, US economic growth is going to be at least 4%. By the end of the next decade, it's going to be at least 6%. The technological revolution we see today is the most unique and incredible in human history. It's more important than the invention of fire, agriculture, printing press, the steam engine, electricity, railroad, the first internet revolution. We'll have growth from 2 to 4 to 6. American exceptionalism is not going to disappear in spite of Trump. Tech trumps tariffs. Tech trumps tariffs. Tech is going to increase potential growth from 2 to 4, 200 basis points of increasing growth. And what's the maximum impact of a trade war on US potential growth? Maybe 50 basis points. So growth is going to go up by 200 basis points regardless of Trump. And the worst that it can damage is 50. It's a ratio of 4 to 1. So tech trumps tariffs. US, Trump is president. You could have President Bernie Sanders, you could have President Kamala Harris, you could have President Mickey Mouse, doesn't matter. Mickey Mouse could be President of the United States, US growth is going to be 4% by the end of the decade, because the dynamism of the private sector is such that in the technology of the future, a dozen of them, it's not just AI, US is number one, China is number two, and Europe is just at the bottom. So US is going to dominate the industries of the future, regardless of the politics of the US. And therefore, the American exceptionalism is not going to change, regardless of Trump.
So the West should not be so worried. Europe should be worried about its future.
Yeah.
But the US, no.
US is going to do great in spite of Trump. Trump could be trying to be destructive of stuff, with trade, with the deficit, with the dollar. He's not going to succeed. As I said, the guardrails are already constrained. The market discipline, the advisor, the Fed independence, the limited majority in Congress, every business leader, every financial leader is telling him, stop doing stupid stuff. He's boxed in. He cannot destroy the US. Even if he was doing stupid things on trade, even if he had a trade war and we get a recession this year, we get 4% growth by the end of the decade, because the potential impact of a full-scale trade war on the US permanently, suppose you have a trade war and you have tariffs of 50% for the next 10 years. Growth potential in US after recession falls only by 50 basis points, while technology is going to increase it by 200 basis points, regardless of a trade war.
Could another war affect this projected growth? Not a trade war. I mean, a lot of people are saying, yesterday I was in a panel and people said that it feels like we're in the 1930s. It's just that the role of the US would be completely different. I mean, if we do eventually have some type of a third world war.
You know, the global order has changed. Economically, monetary, financial, trade, technologically, politically, geopolitically. We're moving from a period of time of relative, stability and order, relative, to a period of relative chaos, instability and volatility. You're going from multilateralism to unilateralism. You're going from providing global public goods to caring only about your national interests. You're going from, internationalism to real politics and national interests. You're going from territorial restraint to territorial grab. There is these changes that are geopolitical, and they're occurring not just in the US, because the authoritarians are not just the US. Trump, is Xi Jinping, is Putin, is other autocrats all over the world. The only bastion still of liberal democracy are, to some extent, Europe. Even Europe is drifting towards MAGA nationalism in some countries, and maybe India among great powers, right? So that's the world we're facing. The world will be very different, where is not the rule of law, is going to be the rule of the jungle. It's not who is right, but who has might, and might makes you right. That's the world of option, following your national interest. And if US is following its national interest, Europeans have to think about their own national interests and they have to reform, because otherwise they're going to be destroyed. They're going to be destroyed. So that's unfortunately the world we live in. But in the world we live in, I don't think we're going to end up in World War III. I think that actually Trump can force an end of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Hopefully he does it in ways in which Ukraine remains democratic, free and sovereign. I think that is not in the interest of Trump to give Ukraine to Russia. If anything, he wants to have all the NATO resources. So it's very transactional. He's going to essentially control Ukraine, says Ukraine is mine. Why should they give Ukraine to Russia? And he's not going to give Western Europe to Russia either, right? Russia is declining power. They have only nuclear weapons. It's a country that is a semi-failed state, 11 time zones, a landmass that is bigger than China, India, Europe and US, 150 million people declining. How can they even survive as Russia? So you think that Trump is going to give Western Europe to Russia? No. Western Europe is mine. I'm American. It's my empire. And they're my vassal. I'm going to keep NATO as long as the Europeans spend more on defense. If European Union disintegrates, meaning becomes less integrated, that's better for Trump, because divide et impera. He'd rather have 27 states and he can negotiate one by one. So it's up to the European to integrate as opposed to disintegrating. But he wants a weaker Europe without a European Union and with a NATO umbrella where the Europeans spend more on defense. So he controls not just the Western Hemisphere. He wants to control the Western Hemisphere. He wants to control Western Europe. He wants to control Ukraine. He wants to contain Russia, and he wants to contain China. It's not going to be a world of sphere of influence where US has the Americas, Russia has Eurasia, and China has Asia. That's not this view. The view is we are still the biggest power in the world.
Yeah.
We control the Western Hemisphere, we control Europe, we control even the near abroad of Russia, and we contain China. That's his view of the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roubini. Dr. Gloom, no more.
No. Dr. Realist always.
Dr.
Always realist.
Always.
I've
Thank
never
you. It
been
was
Dr.
a
Doom.
pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
Pleasure.